On that, I'd also like to introduce Salah Hashmi, who's just joined us, who's a human rights lawyer and the legal advisor to the Council for Iraqi Opposition. Joins us from London. Thank you so much, Salah, for joining us. Now, when we're talking about all of this, what's happening in Iraq, what's happening all throughout the world, give us a sense of what the role the government should play in terms of protecting the protesters' human rights.
Well, first of all, I think one needs to address the root causes of these demonstrations. I think what happened since 2003, particularly in Iraq, because I have been dealing with Iraqis for some time, is the establishment of a parallel system. And that is one that is a government-established system and one that is a non-government established system, whereby armed militias have sprung up from various factions backed up by political parties who are usually trying to enforce a foreign agenda. Now, what has happened is the government has lost control, because although there may be some certain elements within the government that want to introduce reform and also protect the demonstrators, I would say that they are sometimes incapable of doing so, because of the existence of these armed militias, because they operate outside the boundaries of the law. We have recently had, in fact, within the last 24 hours, threats from certain armed militias that they will interfere if the government is threatened. They're not really saying that because the government is threatened, it's because their own interests are threatened. And therefore, the government seems to be somewhat helpless, because we have found that there are some genuine approaches by the security services towards the demonstrators in protecting them and at times even helping them. But there are also elements whom we would call imposters, who are trying to wreak havoc, who are trying to inspire that there will be a violent reaction from either peaceful demonstrators in order for the security services to react to those violent inactions and treat them with harshness. So I don't think the government, all in all, is being able to control the situation given the anger of the people on the streets.
Right. Salah, now let's talk more about what is happening in Iraq and to what you understand from why it is happening at this point in time. What do you think is essential about the timing?
Well, I think it's really repeated and several repeated failures by the government to meet the demands, the legitimate demands of the demonstrators. They have been calling upon the government to improve their conditions, to improve the status of security within the country, these services, and most importantly, to curb the endemic corruption within the country. There have been reports of horrific numbers lost to corruption in Iraq since 2003. We have had dummy institutions, such as the ones proclaiming to curb corruption, but they have been completely unable to do anything about it. Again, I go back to the existence of armed militias backed by political parties, simply because it is their own interests that they are serving, and they will not allow in any way a genuine investigation by any independent organization, and then that would be followed up naturally by the course of law, and that is the prosecution of those who are guilty. Right. That has happened. The demonstrators have repeated their demands for that to have happened, and it seems to be that the government either unwilling or incapable of doing so. So I don't think there is a specific reason as to the timing of the demonstrations. It is a fact that the government has repeatedly failed to meet their demands, and their demands appear to be legitimate even by the government's own admission. But right. As I say it, they seem to be incapable of doing anything about it.
Right. Salah, this is something that we have been talking about before you joined us as well, is that the global climate of how protests are unfolding across every region in the world, in country after country, is also inspiring other regions. Do you think that might be also the case in Iraq?
Well, it could be. If you want to trace back the roots of world revolution, you would need to go back to all the way to 1917, and that is the Russian Revolution. Your viewers may not know that out of the Russian Revolution came out two schools of thought, the Lenin School of Thought and the Trotsky School of Thought. The Lenin school of thought won the argument in that we should keep the revolution within the Russian Federation boundaries. The Trotsky idea was to inspire revolution all around the world without any borders. Now, since the invasion of Iraq back in 2003, this was followed up by complete instability within the whole region, and I mean that within the Middle East. And I think it has spread slowly but gradually amongst other countries, namely particularly Syria and many other Arab countries. Is it the case that they are connected in any way? I don't think they are, but they are certainly inspired by one another. Right. Certainly there was a very famous slogan amongst Iraqi demonstrators when they first started these most recent set of demonstrations back on the 1st of October this year, is that you are no less than your fellow Egyptian demonstrators. And that inspired them to go out on the streets in vast numbers and to make their demands very well clear, not only to the government, but to the entire world.
Right. John, I'm going to go back to talk to you about something you mentioned earlier on in our discussion, and I think it's worthwhile to go back to it. The importance of social media in all of this. Now, social media connects, it inspires, and it also spreads across a message. But it is also misused by authoritarian governments and those who want to control the protests. Do you see that happening now more than ever?
The attempt to control social media. Yes, this has created a crisis within governments all across the world, including in the West. You saw the whole hysteria whipped up over Russiagate, the allegations that Russia had interfered in the 2016 US presidential election that produced Donald Trump as the president, and have had similar allegations when it comes to Brexit. And this is hysteria, unfounded claims of Russian interference. I do a lot of work with Russian media, and that's been put into that same box as a sort of nefarious actor trying to undermine the Western liberal democratic order. We saw a similar parallel with this when the Vietnam War. If you recall, some of your older viewers will recall, the footage from the Vietnam War was raw. These were not embedded journalists, and this was the advent of television, the mass availability of television. People were able to watch news at their homes, and they were seeing the atrocities that were being committed by US forces, and this fed the anti-Vietnam War movement, which became a material force in the 1960s, and that was a big anti-Vietnam War movement in the UK as well, laying siege to the US Embassy in London at various points. And this brought into being the censorship of television news. Now we have embedded journalists. We saw this in the war in Iraq. Now I contend that if you had the multiplicity of international news channels such as your own channel, RT, various other channels that have come on board since the Iraq war, it would have been much harder for them to press ahead with the Iraq war. And despite that...
And John, sorry, since we're running short on time, that's an interesting point you make, and I want to take that and ask his opinion regarding that. Salah, what are your thoughts on what John just said?
I think I totally agree. Although there were a number of news channels that were present in Iraq, in particular, I would cite Al Jazeera, who had one of their correspondents unfortunately killed during the first days of the occupation of Baghdad. And that, of course, caused a huge big stir within the media sector and the population itself. Now, unfortunately, there are, as I said, there are imposters within the demonstrators who are putting or publicizing false news in the hope that somebody might rely on that news or those video clips, if you like, and then they are named and shamed as being spreading false news about what's happening on the ground. So people need to be extremely careful about what they publicize, because some of this news is false and some of it is being put out falsely and deliberately in order to mask what's happening on the ground. So although the internet and information technologies is an extremely useful tool to publicize what's happening on the ground, each person with a mobile phone is in fact a correspondent of his own. However, one needs to be extremely cautious about what to relay and what to publicize, because that could be used against them.
Right. On that point, I'd like to thank Salah Hashmi for joining us and John White for joining us for this very interesting discussion. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to have another story for you. Stay with us.